On the evening of June 24, 2026, a building in the Altamira neighborhood of Caracas crumbled floor by floor. It was 22 stories tall. It had stood for decades, and from the moment the second earthquake hit, it took less than 30 seconds to come down. Witnesses on the street described watching the walls peel outward. Entire apartments exposed mid-air, furniture, belongings, the interiors of people's lives, hanging for a moment before everything fell. The dust cloud that rose above the surrounding buildings was visible from kilometers away. This was not an unusual building for Caracas. It was not poorly located. It was not a shantytown structure built overnight on a hillside. It was a formal residential tower in one of the city's better-known neighborhoods, and it collapsed like it was made of paper. The question that structural engineers, seismologists, and disaster response teams began asking within hours of the earthquake is the same question that this documentary is going to answer. Why? To understand why Caracas's buildings failed the way they did on June 24th, you need to understand two things: the earthquake itself and the city it hit. Start with the earthquake. At 6:04 p.m. local time, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck near San Felipe in Yaracuy State, roughly 8.2 miles below the surface. The energy release traveled outward through the crust, reaching Caracas within seconds. The shaking lasted long enough for people to feel it clearly, to look at each other, to decide whether to move toward a doorframe or a stairwell. Then, 39 seconds later, a second earthquake hit. Magnitude 7.5, larger than the first, shallower. The epicenter was near Yumare in the same fault zone. This is what seismologists call a doublet earthquake, two large events in rapid succession along the same fault system, each redistributing stress that triggers or amplifies the other. For a building, the doublet dynamic is catastrophic in a specific way. The first earthquake cracks foundations, shifts load-bearing walls, loosens the connections between structural elements. A building that survives the first event is no longer the building it was before it. Its tolerances have narrowed, its margins have shrunk, and then before any of that damage can be assessed or addressed, the second wave arrives. USGS seismologist Paul Earle described it plainly. When two earthquakes are this close together, the shaking never fully stops between them. The energy from the first event has not dissipated when the second begins. For anything standing in the affected zone, it is effectively one continuous, escalating event. In the Altamira Tower, the first earthquake cracked the building. The second earthquake finished it. Now understand the city it hit. Caracas is not a city that was built for this. Venezuela sits at the boundary where the South American tectonic plate and the Caribbean plate grind against each other. The movement is lateral, strike-slip, like California's San Andreas Fault, meaning the two plates slide horizontally past each other, rather than one diving beneath the other. This type of fault produces intense, shallow shaking that propagates efficiently through urban areas. The last major earthquake to strike this fault system with comparable force was in 1900. A magnitude 7.7 event that hit when Caracas was a fraction of its current size, when most of its buildings were low-rise adobe and brick, and when the population of the entire country was under 3 million people. For the 126 years between 1900 and 2026, the fault was quiet, not inactive. Small earthquakes occurred regularly, and seismologists had long identified the zone as high risk. But the kind of event that tests a city's buildings, its infrastructure, its emergency systems, that had not come. In those 126 years, Caracas grew from a colonial town into a metropolitan area of over 3 million people. It grew rapidly, unevenly, and under governance conditions that changed dramatically over time. The city that the earthquake hit on June 24th was built across more than a century of construction that included formal engineering, informal construction, government housing projects, private towers, and hillside barrios, all subject to different standards, different oversight, and different levels of maintenance. Many of the buildings that stood in Caracas on Wednesday evening had been built during periods when seismic codes either did not exist or were not enforced. Venezuela passed its first modern seismic building code in 1955. It was revised in 1982 and again in 2001. Each revision strengthened the requirements. But a code revision does not retrofit the buildings that already exist. It only governs what gets built afterward. And in Venezuela, even the buildings constructed after the codes were written were not always built to them. Enforcement is the gap between what a building code says and what actually gets built. In Venezuela, that gap widened significantly during the economic collapse of the 2010s. The construction industry contracted, regulatory agencies lost staff and funding, inspections that should have happened did not happen, materials that should have met specifications were substituted with cheaper alternatives because the alternatives were what was available. Civil engineer Ricardo Parra, who worked in Caracas's construction sector for over 2 decades, described the situation in an interview before the earthquake. He said that by the mid-2010s, the idea of a building inspection in most of Caracas had become theoretical. The inspectors existed on paper, the visits were not happening, and contractors who had cut corners on rebar density or concrete mix ratios knew that no one was coming to check. Rebar density matters because reinforced concrete gets its strength from the combination of concrete and steel. The concrete resists compression, the steel resists tension. An earthquake subjects a building to both simultaneously in rapidly alternating directions. If the steel reinforcement inside the concrete columns and walls is insufficient, fewer bars than specified, thinner gauge, improperly spaced, the building can absorb the first wave of shaking but fail under the second or third. Concrete mix ratio matters because concrete that is mixed with too much water or too little cement cures softer than specification. It looks the same from the outside. It passes visual inspection, but under seismic stress, it does not perform the way the structural calculations assumed it would. These are not exotic failures. They are the ordinary failures of a construction industry operating without effective oversight in an economy under severe stress. They are exactly the kinds of failures that earthquake engineers look for when they examine buildings that collapsed in earthquakes they should have survived. In Caracas, the number of buildings with these kinds of failures was not small. The hillside barrios present a different but related problem. Caracas is built in a valley surrounded by steep terrain. As the city's population grew, development climbed the hillsides. The barrios, informal neighborhoods that house a large share of Caracas's population, were built on slopes that formal urban planning had not designated for residential use, using construction methods that ranged from reasonably solid to structurally precarious. Hillside construction amplifies earthquake shaking through a phenomenon called topographic amplification. Ground motion is more intense at the crest of a hill or ridge than at its base. Buildings on steep slopes are also subject to lateral forces from the hillside itself. Soil liquefaction, landslides, and slope failures that can destroy a structure even if the structure itself was built soundly. After the 2010 Haiti earthquake, engineers analyzing the damage found that hillside structures had failed at significantly higher rates than valley floor structures of comparable construction quality. Venezuela's terrain, combined with the density of informal hillside construction in Caracas, created similar vulnerability. On Wednesday night, multiple barrio neighborhoods reported building collapses and landslides within the first hour after the earthquake. The scale of damage in those areas was still being assessed days later because the roads connecting them to the rest of the city were blocked by debris and rescue teams could not yet reach them. La Guaira presents yet another dimension of the problem. The state sits on a narrow coastal strip between the Caribbean Sea and the coastal mountain range, a location that creates its own seismic vulnerabilities. The mountains amplify ground motion. The coastal soil, in many areas a mix of fill, alluvium, and reclaimed land, is susceptible to liquefaction, a process by which saturated soil loses its structural integrity during shaking and behaves temporarily like a liquid. Buildings founded on liquefiable soil can sink, tilt, or collapse even when the shaking itself was not severe enough to damage the structure directly. The building does not fail, the ground beneath it fails. The Macuto waterfront, where some of La Guaira's most significant damage occurred, sits on exactly this kind of coastal fill. The historic Macuto Hotel, which had stood on the waterfront for decades, came down. Port facilities sustained damage. Simon Bolivar International Airport, built partly on reclaimed coastal land, was shut down after the runway sustained surface deformation and terminal columns showed structural cracking. Engineers sent to assess the airport on Thursday morning found that the damage, while serious, was not necessarily irreparable. The terminal columns had cracked but had not fully failed. The runway deformation was significant, but localized. A full structural assessment would take days. In the meantime, the airport remained closed, and all international access to Venezuela was routed through Valencia. The pattern that emerges from Altamira, the Barrios, and La Guaira is consistent. Venezuela had the seismic codes. The country had experienced engineers who understood the risk. The fault system that caused Wednesday's earthquake had been mapped and studied for decades. The Venezuelan Foundation of Seismological Research, known as FUNVISIS, had published detailed risk assessments for Caracas and the surrounding region. Those assessments identified the areas of highest vulnerability. They identified the building types most likely to fail. They recommended mitigation measures. The gap was not knowledge. The gap was implementation. Retrofitting a building to meet modern seismic standards costs money. In a country where public finances had collapsed, where the construction sector had contracted, and where the government's capacity to enforce building codes had degraded alongside everything else, the retrofitting did not happen. The inspections did not happen. The risk that FUNVISIS had documented in reports that were publicly available remained unaddressed in the buildings where people lived and worked. On Wednesday evening, when the second earthquake hit 39 seconds after the first, those buildings met the seismic forces they had been designed to resist, or in many cases had not been designed to resist at all. The result was 188 confirmed dead, 971 injured, and hundreds still missing in the rubble of a city where the earthquake had been predicted. Not the date, not the magnitude, but the outcome. The outcome had been predicted. The immediate rescue operation ran into the same infrastructure failures that had made the buildings vulnerable in the first place. Cell networks were down across northern Venezuela, not because the earthquake destroyed them all at once, but because a system that had been degrading for years finally crossed the threshold into failure under the additional stress of a major seismic event. Backup power at cell tower sites had not been maintained. When the grid went down in earthquake-affected neighborhoods, the towers went with it. Roads in Caracas sustained damage in multiple locations. A city built in a valley surrounded by terrain prone to rockfall and landslide found several of its main corridors blocked within the first hour. Emergency vehicles trying to reach the Altamira collapse site encountered debris on the road. The route to La Guaira, which runs through a mountain tunnel, was closed for inspection after the tunnel sustained cracking. The tunnel closure was significant. It is the main road connecting Caracas to the coast, to the airport, and to the port. With it closed, traffic that would normally move in minutes now required a detour of over an hour through mountain roads that were themselves being assessed for damage. Hospitals across Caracas began receiving casualties within minutes of the earthquake. Venezuela's public hospital system had been operating below capacity for years, underfunded, understaffed, lacking basic supplies. The surge of injured patients on Wednesday evening hit institutions that had no reserve capacity to absorb it. International medical teams, part of the broader aid response that began arriving Thursday, brought supplies that Venezuelan hospitals had been requesting for years: surgical equipment, blood products, medications. The earthquake created the justification and the logistics for delivering what the country's health system had been unable to procure on its own. The USGS published its casualty modeling Thursday morning. Their estimate placed a 39% probability on a final death toll between 1,000 and 10,000 people, a 37% probability on a toll exceeding 10,000. The modeling is based on the recorded magnitudes, the depth and location of the earthquakes, population density data, and assessments of building stock vulnerability in the affected region. The building stock vulnerability data for Venezuela is not new. It has been available to researchers and policymakers for years. The USGS modeling uses it not as a surprise finding but as a known input, a documented characteristic of Caracas's built environment that the agency incorporates into its standard post-earthquake analysis. What the model is saying, in technical language, is that Caracas was a high-consequence target for this kind of earthquake before the earthquake happened. The combination of seismic hazard and building vulnerability was known. The event was plausible. The damage, while catastrophic, fell within the range that engineers had calculated as possible. For the families pulling their relatives from rubble on Wednesday night, that calculation was abstract. For the engineers and policymakers who had written those risk assessments and watched them go unimplemented over years of economic and political crisis, the events of June 24th were not a surprise. They were a confirmation of something they had been warning about for a long time. What comes next for Caracas is a question that does not have a clean answer. The immediate task is rescue. Teams from the United States, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, El Salvador, Spain, Qatar, and Mexico were operating across multiple collapse sites as of Friday morning. The 72-hour window during which survivors are most likely to be found in rubble was closing. Teams were transitioning from rescue operations to recovery operations at some sites while continuing active search at others. The medium-term task is assessment. Every building in the affected area needs to be evaluated. Structures with visible damage need to be inspected by engineers before anyone returns to them. In a city the size of Caracas, with a building stock as varied as Caracas has, that assessment will take weeks and require hundreds of qualified inspectors. The long-term task is reconstruction. The $200 million fund announced by acting President Rodriguez is a starting point. Engineers consulted by international organizations estimated that rebuilding the collapsed structures, repairing damaged infrastructure, and retrofitting the buildings that survived but are now compromised will cost several billion dollars. The assessment of that total will not be complete for months. Venezuela enters that reconstruction process with depleted public finances, a construction sector that has contracted sharply over the past decade, and an international relationship complicated by years of sanctions and diplomatic tension. The aid that arrived in the days after the earthquake demonstrated that the political complications can be set aside in an acute crisis. Whether they can be set aside long enough to support a multi-year reconstruction is a different question. The buildings that failed on Wednesday were the product of decades of accumulated decisions. Decisions about enforcement and investment and maintenance and oversight made across multiple governments, across multiple economic cycles, across 126 years of quiet on a fault line that everyone knew was not dead. The buildings that replace them will be the product of decisions made now, in the months and years after June 24, 2026. Those decisions have not yet been made. The earthquake lasted 39 seconds. It revealed in 39 seconds what had been accumulating for decades, not just in the buildings, but in the systems behind the buildings, the inspection regimes, the maintenance schedules, the budgets, the enforcement, the political will to prioritize seismic risk in a country dealing with simultaneous economic, social, and institutional crises. Caracas was a city that had been warned. The warnings were technical, detailed, and specific. They named the fault. They described the building types most likely to fail. They mapped the neighborhoods at highest risk. They estimated the casualties under different earthquake scenarios. On June 24, 2026, those estimates became a death toll. Subscribe if you want to follow the reconstruction, the accountability questions, and what the engineering community is recommending for the buildings that Caracas builds next. The next video on your screen covers the human side of this disaster, the 7.7 million Venezuelans abroad who spent Wednesday night unable to reach their families, and what those 11 hours of silence felt like from thousands of miles away. Stay informed. There is a building code provision that engineers call the strong column weak beam principle. The idea is straightforward. In an earthquake, a building needs to absorb energy somewhere. If that energy is absorbed in the beams, the horizontal structural members connecting columns, the building can deform, crack, even partially fail in its beams and still remain standing. The columns, which carry the vertical load of the floors above, stay intact. The building leans. It damages. It may be unrepairable afterward, but it does not collapse, and the people inside have time to get out. If the energy is absorbed in the columns instead, if the columns crack and fail before the beams, the vertical load path is interrupted. The floors above lose their support. The building does not lean. It falls. Venezuelan engineers knew this principle. It is in the building code. It is taught in every structural engineering program in the country. The buildings that collapsed in Altamira and elsewhere on Wednesday night collapsed because their columns failed. That is visible in the debris. When investigators examine collapse patterns, the ratio of column failure to beam failure tells them immediately whether the building was built to code or not. In the Altamira Tower, Preliminary observations by engineers who reached the site Thursday morning indicated column failure throughout the lower floors, not beam failure. Column failure. The strong column, weak beam principle had not been achieved. The building had been built in a way that made collapse, under sufficient seismic loading, nearly inevitable. This is not a new finding for Caracas. Studies conducted after smaller earthquakes in the region, events that did not reach Wednesday's magnitude, had already identified column failure patterns in damaged buildings across the city. Those studies were published, they were presented at conferences, they were available to the government and to the construction industry. The buildings were not fixed. There is a second technical factor that concerns the age of the concrete. Concrete does not stay the same over time. In coastal and humid environments like La Guaira and parts of Caracas, chloride exposure from sea air accelerates the corrosion of the steel reinforcement inside. The rebar rusts, expands, and cracks the concrete from inside, a process called spalling. A building with severely corroded rebar looks normal from the outside. Without opening the walls and testing the steel directly, the deterioration is invisible. Several of the buildings that collapsed on Wednesday were constructed in the 1960s and 1970s, between 50 and 65 years old. In a well-maintained building in a dry climate, that age is manageable. In an inadequately maintained building in a coastal humid environment with deferred maintenance and unknown rebar condition, it is not. The combination of aging concrete, corroded steel, and a doublet earthquake of this magnitude created conditions that engineers reviewing the evidence would describe as unsurvivable for those specific structures. The 1967 Caracas earthquake offers a painful comparison. On July 29, 1967, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck the same fault zone. It killed between 217 and 240 people, depending on the source. It collapsed 4 modern apartment buildings in the Altamira neighborhood, the same neighborhood where a tower collapsed on Wednesday. The 1967 earthquake was less than half the energy of Wednesday's 7.5 event. The buildings it collapsed were newer, having been constructed in the boom years of Venezuela's oil wealth, when enforcement was theoretically more active, yet they fell. After 1967, Venezuela revised its seismic building code. Engineers studied the collapse patterns. The government commissioned reports. The international engineering community examined the failures and published recommendations. 59 years later, in the same neighborhood, another tower collapsed under conditions that the post-1967 code revisions were explicitly designed to prevent. This is not coincidence. It is the result of a gap between what codes say and what buildings receive, a gap that was smaller in the decades of oil wealth, when enforcement had more resources, and wider in the decades of economic decline, when it did not. The difference in death toll between 1967 and Wednesday will not be fully known until the rubble is cleared, but the direction of the difference was predictable. What Venezuela needs now falls into 3 categories. The first is immediate: completing rescue operations, getting medical resources to overwhelmed hospitals, restoring power and water to affected neighborhoods. The second is medium-term: rapid safety assessments of every building in the affected area, with clear green, yellow, or red tags posted so residents know which structures can be reoccupied, and temporary housing for the thousands of families who cannot return. The third is long-term, and it is the hardest: retrofitting damaged buildings, enforcing the building code on new construction in a way that produces buildings that actually match their specifications. That requires inspection agencies with staff and funding, legal accountability for non-compliant builders, and a government with the institutional capacity to sustain enforcement not just in the weeks after a disaster, but across the years between major earthquakes when the urgency fades. Venezuela has produced the codes. The seismic building code is technically sound. What has been harder to sustain is everything required to make the code real in actual buildings. The next major earthquake on this fault will come. What it looks like depends on what gets built and maintained between now and then. The earthquake lasted 39 seconds. It revealed in 39 seconds what had been accumulating for decades, not just in the buildings, but in the systems behind the buildings, the inspection regimes, the maintenance schedules, the budgets, the enforcement, the political will to prioritize seismic risk in a country dealing with simultaneous economic, social, and institutional crises. Caracas was a city that had been warned. The warnings were technical, detailed, and specific. They named the fault. They described the building types most likely to fail. They mapped the neighborhoods at highest risk. They estimated the casualties under different earthquake scenarios. On June 24, 2026, those estimates became a death toll. Subscribe if you want to follow the reconstruction, the accountability questions, and what the engineering community is recommending for the buildings that Caracas builds next. The next video on your screen covers the human side of this disaster, the 7.7 million Venezuelans abroad who spent Wednesday night unable to reach their families, and what those 11 hours of silence felt like from thousands of miles away. Stay informed.